UAL's new mission of social purpose centres on engaging creatively with climate action and anti-racism. I'll briefly show why these two great movements should be connected as climate justice, and then I'll outline some ways for reaching agreement on action. Since the Industrial Revolution, burning fossil fuels has enabled the accumulation of vast wealth, transforming the earth and dividing the world. It's common knowledge that the most affected people and areas of the world who did the least to cause climate breakdown are also the least equipped to cope with it. But what's not widely acknowledged is that the reason they're least equipped is because they've been systematically impoverished by centuries of colonisation followed by decades of globalisation. London's status as a global financial centre was built on its accumulation of wealth as capital of the British Empire, which was powered by slave labour and fossil fuels. But in November 2021, the UK Chancellor announced at COP26 that Britain planned to become the world's first net zero financial centre. Organisations will soon have to set out detailed, time-bound and funded transition plans for getting to net zero carbon emissions. And science-based targets are the foundation for such plans. I persuaded UAL to commit to developing science-based targets in order to define an emissions reduction pathway that stays within a just share of the global carbon budget. The global carbon budget is the crucial link between decarbonisation and decolonisation, because showing that there is a limit to how much carbon can be emitted raises the question of who gets to emit that carbon. Science-based targets enable organisations not just to reduce carbon, but also to preserve fresh water, regenerate land, protect oceans and support biodiversity. Science-based targets don't prescribe how this should be done, but they do establish the key facts that enable different groups of people to work towards a common goal. Science-based targets build on the work of the Stockholm Resilience Centre, which identified 9 planetary boundaries in the Earth system. While the amber zones on this diagram show ecological overshoot, the green zone in the centre shows a safe operating space for humanity. Kate Raworth developed this green zone, proposing a safe and just space for humanity, which respects the environmental ceiling of ecological limits and the social foundation of human rights. Science-based targets align with the planetary boundaries and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The Stockholm Resilience Centre proposed a new way of working with these goals so that the economy serves society and stays within the safe operating space of the biosphere. So UAL's public commitment to science-based targets means that our climate action can be proportionate to the emergency, coherent with our values of anti-racism, and integrated with our mission of social purpose. But there may be trouble ahead. Recent research identifies interlinked tipping elements in the Earth system. These include slowing of the great ocean currents, dieback of the Amazon rainforest, and collapse of the polar ice sheets. A chain reaction between these processes could be triggered if global warming exceeds 2 degrees centigrade. And the latest UN emissions gap report warns that business as usual will result in 2.8 degrees of global warming. This means leaving behind the safe operating space for humanity and entering a dangerous place of uncontrollable risks. And yet the situation is constantly changing. Russia's invasion of Ukraine did cause a surge of fossil fuel investment, but it also spurred a deep shift towards renewable energy. But beware, decarbonisation is being framed as a race to simply swap fossil fuels for renewable energy. Pushing for economic growth while hoping that technology will save us only worsens the problems we face. Whether powered by fossil fuels or renewable energy, endless growth means extracting ever more materials and dumping ever more waste. In contrast, climate justice brings together decolonisation and decarbonisation to offer a coherent and fair alternative. UAL's plan to increase the number of students conflicts with its plan to decarbonise and could weaken our shared sense of identity. On the other hand, what I've called post-carbon internationalism could help build networks of solidarity with the most affected people and areas around the world. But for solidarity to be more than performative, we must balance the desire to grow with a willingness to learn, beyond the limits of Eurocentric knowledge. And we have to have a clear sense of scale and proportion. This diagram uses scale and proportion as a way of ranking categories of domestic energy use. So with the so-called energy crisis, people don't need to eat cold food or stay in the dark, but they could turn down the gas central heating and wear warmer clothes. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol divides organisations' carbon emissions into 3 scopes. Scope 1 is fuel used in the organisation's cars or boilers. Scope 2 is purchased electricity, heat and steam. And Scope 3 is everything else: supply chains, transport and air travel. UAL has pledged to reduce its Scope 1 and 2 emissions by 92%, no later than 2030. And the aim is to reduce Scope 3 emissions by 54%, no later than 2040. But shown in proportion, we see that while our Scope 1 and 2 emissions together are less than 7% of the total, Scope 3 emissions are 93% of the total. And UAL's business model is still dependent on international student fees, which massively increases our emissions from air travel. And that's not all. There's a surge of around 400,000 tonnes of carbon emissions from the new buildings for LCC and LCF. These emissions might be deleted from the calculation of our carbon footprint, but I think that acknowledging them is a major opportunity to learn. At Elephant and Castle and at Stratford, the emissions from UAL constructing buildings of concrete, steel and glass are very large and very real. But although it's too late now to change the buildings, it should still be possible to influence the fit-out to take account of new patterns of working after COVID and the new evidence of climate breakdown. The key thing we should take account of is the global carbon budget, possibly the prime example of a planetary boundary. Science shows that there is an absolute limit to how much carbon can be emitted before triggering uncontrollable climate breakdown. The limit is calculated by adding up all carbon emissions and subtracting all the carbon absorbed by the world's forests, soils and oceans. The problem is that sources and sinks of carbon work on different timescales, so the simple idea of a balance between them is not just misleading, it's dangerous. Carbon offsets confuse basic science by wrongly treating the Earth's biosphere as a sink for fossil carbon emissions. Planting trees, protecting soils and restoring mangroves are vital to preserve biodiversity and enhance human well-being. But forests, soils and oceans have limited carbon storage capacity, and they can quickly re-release carbon back into the atmosphere, such as when there's a forest fire. So these actions cannot offset fossil fuel combustion. Fossil carbon and biological carbon are just not interchangeable. To understand the increasing risks of climate breakdown, and so to reduce and adapt to those risks, the United Nations has developed 5 shared socio-economic pathways. These are plausible scenarios of the future climate. Sadly, the one called sustainability is now the least likely scenario. Instead, the world is currently on track for a mix of what's called regional rivalry and fossil fuel development. So as a place of creative education and research, at UAL we should explore what this means and to help our students prepare. As members of the Climate Justice Action Group, we could share ideas, discuss how they relate to our aims, and give constructive feedback to help develop ideas into proposals. When we start to think about which actions we should take to tackle the climate crisis, we could use post-it notes. On orange notes, we could put actions we would like to see stopped or reduced. And on yellow notes, or why not green, we could put actions we would like to see started or increased. Next, we can rank these ideas against two axes. How much carbon could it save, and how soon can it be done? Having generated and sorted initial ideas, we could apply aspects of a peer review process to refine and develop them into proposals. The UAL Research Degrees Committee operates a similar system at the key stages of a PhD. By experimenting in a transparent and systematic way, the Climate Justice Action Group could generate new knowledge which I think would be worthy of publication. Here are some criteria that we could use to collectively decide which ideas to develop into proposals and take forward into actions. Firstly, decarbonisation. How much could the action reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Just as important, decolonisation. How effectively could the action advance understanding of racial justice? Knowing how long an action would take to realise is crucial if we're to act with urgency. But time to realise also means when in the academic year it would be most effective to carry out the action. If the action needs money or resources, we'd need to estimate the cost and later prepare a budget. And it will also be crucial to show how our proposals relate to UAL's Climate Action Plan and the Strategy for Research and Knowledge Exchange as part of UAL's wider mission of social purpose. These are just suggestions. To agree a method that you can work with, your input and feedback is vital. So thanks again for today, and let's meet again soon. Bye for now.